So now that we've learned what JSON and AJAX are, let's take a look at a project that will use them in a pretty simple way. This is a really basic project, but it should give you an idea of how to start off sending messages to the server, sending those HTTP requests to the server using JavaScript. So let's go ahead into our GAE web dev folder, and we're going to move to step 13 now. So we'll go into step 13. And from here, we can take a look at our README file, which is pretty simple. It just says, okay, this is an example using XMLHttpRequest to send and retrieve or receive data. So that will work. Let's go ahead into our GAE project folder. And here you can see we have a couple of files. We have an app.yaml, a main.py, a requirements.txt, and a static files folder. So these aren't terribly exciting. The app.yaml, the requirements text, those are all pretty much what we would expect. But if we look over at our main.py, so let's take a look at step 13, we can look into our GAE project and we'll see our main.py. It's going to do a couple of things here. It's basically, there are really just a few possible options for what we can request. We can request an index.html, and if we look at that, it's a pretty basic one. We've got an HTML page here. If we look at the others, though, we have a get data. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a dictionary. It's going to set one property or one key in that dictionary to the current time on the server. And then it's going to return a Flask response that is JSON. And note, we're going to set the mimic type here, application JSON. So we're going to send this back as JSON data. And then we have another one here that will add two numbers. So post data is going to retrieve a number and a second number. And then we're going to try to parse those into numbers. If we run into an error, we're going to set an error in this dictionary. And then we're going to, if we run into any of those errors, we'll set that error. And if we don't have any errors, we're going to set a result in that dictionary. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to create a response that is basically just this dictionary converted to JSON. And then we're going to return that as application JSON type. So pretty straightforward here on the HTML side. We'll take a look at on the Python side. We'll take a look at the JavaScript in just one moment. Let's go ahead and run the dev app server. Go ahead and authorize that. That'll just take a moment. That should be moving now. We should be able to get that started. So since that's going, let's take a look at our script file in the meantime. So some of the functions that we define in our slides, we'll see those. We have that create XMLHttp function, and that's just going to retrieve an XMLHttp object for us. And we have a post parameters, the post parameters, the send JSON request. Those are functions we saw. One function that's new here is this is a function that will take an object, full of properties, and just the top level properties here. But you can see this will take an object that has properties and values, and then convert that to a parameter string. So we use this encode URI component function that's built into JavaScript, and this allows us to take all of the different characters that might be in that name or in that value, and then we convert those to URI compatible characters. So some characters you can't actually put into a URL, things like I believe that the brackets, they can't be in a URL. So if you put those in, it will automatically escape those. So you don't have to worry about what the process is for escaping these particular values. So we can build that. We'll use this object to parameters. And then let's go ahead and take a look at this. I think that our server should have started up by now. So we can now take a look at this on port 8080. And this is a simple JSON test. So we're going to click this button, and it's going to say the server time is 2022 1028. So this is just giving us that server time, the time at the server. And if we go back to our code here, we can start off with the index.html, and you can see we have this is our main content. And when we click this button, we call that load server time function. So let's step through that and see what actually happens. So load server time. It's right here. So get data. So we can take a look at this directly because this get data, this is very similar to that post parameters function that we built. This is going to allow us to send a get request, though, to just retrieve some data. So we're doing the same kind of thing. We are creating an XML/HTTP object. We are creating a ready state change event handler. And when that ready state is 4, then we are going to take the response. We're going to create an object from it, and we're going to call a callback function. So let's take a look at the URL directly. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to type in get data here, just so we can see what this looks like. So you can see from our Python code that we had, this get data creates a dictionary, sets a property called server time, and then returns a response. And when you open that in the browser, you can see this is exactly what it looks like. This looks like a JavaScript object with a property that is server time and a value. So that works pretty much as we would expect it to work. So let's take a look at go back to our JavaScript. So this get data function, again, we have a URL and then a callback function. It's going to call out, it's going to retrieve that little object that has the server time property. And when we receive a response here, so basically when ready state is 4, we will call into this particular code. So what happens here is we call get data, and we're going to define a function. We're just going to create an anonymous function here on the fly so that we can get the result in the target URL. So the result is going to be that object that comes back from the server, and if we log that, you can take a look. We can see when we go back to the page here, we hit server time, it's going to show us that object again, so that's logged to the console so we can see that. And then we're going to set the content there for that main content div element to the server time is, and then that particular value. So when we run this function, the first thing we do is we call get data with this particular value for a URL and this particular callback function. So we go to get data, we create our XMLHttp, we define this, but it doesn't actually get executed yet. We open our connection and then we send our data. So now what happens is this onReadyState function will be called. It'll be called for 0 and 1, 2, and then eventually that ready state will be 4, and that's when this code executes. So this section will actually execute after we hit send. And this XMLHttp ready state, when it's 4, we're going to get that object. We're going to call the callback function, which again is our anonymous function here. So this is now going to be called with the result from the server. We're going to get that, and we're going to get the original URL, and that's going to be the action we execute, the code right in this particular this function block. So you have to jump around a little bit in this mechanism. You have to think a little bit about what's being called when. Sometimes you're defining something so that it can be called later. But if you start thinking about this as defining functions that we will use when we get a response, then you can start thinking about the timing that's involved in this. So the other example here is just a simple calculator that is going to multiply on the server. So I click this button and we multiply the servers or multiply those values on the server, and you can see the result is 45. So similarly, what happens here when we call multiply on server, we're creating this object with a property of num1 and num2, and we're going to retrieve those form values. So we're going to retrieve the form values that we just entered, and we're going to populate a num1 and a num2 variable, and then we're going to send the JSON request. So we remember this one from the slides. We have a send JSON request where we're going to create an XMLHttp object. We're going to define another function handler, and all that's going to do is parse that response from the server and then call a callback function that we are going to define and pass into the send JSON request function. Then we're going to post those parameters. So once we post those, then we will come into as the ready state changes, we'll call this onReadyStateChange function. We'll get to 4 or get to 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And then we'll call that callback function, which we have defined here. So this is another anonymous function, and what we're doing with this function is we are going to first log the result. If we get an error, we're going to set the error in that top box, and if we don't get an error, then we'll just set the result, which is what we saw. So 9 and 5. So if we do 3 and 17 and multiply those numbers, so you can see here the result is 51, and we get that response back. If we put in something like well, these are both numbers, but if you were to hack this to include something that wasn't a number, then you would actually get an error here. So for example, if we hit multiply servers or multiply numbers on the server, you can see we got an error parsing the second parameter. And if we put in, say, a number here and hit that, we'll get an error parsing the first parameter. And if you remember, the reason why it doesn't tell us both of those errors is because in our main.py, we only set one error. We don't make that a list of errors, or we don't append to it. So it's only going to show the last error that was found on the server. But you can see by setting this error, now we have a way we can kind of identify that there was a problem. But this will allow us, a very simple way of sending some information to the server, receiving an object response back, and then setting some text on the screen in response to that. So you can see this is a pretty basic and trivial JavaScript example using JSON and in AJAX. But we click the button, we get the server time. We click this button, we get the actual multiplication. And all of that work is happening at the server. Now this is trivial, but you might want to have data at the server that you're loading dynamically, and that's going to make a lot more sense. So we'll get into another example in just a moment, but this one should show you the basic details of how to use this and how to trace the JavaScript when things are executing. Thanks for watching.